I'm Courtney Smith.
And I'm Elise Sharp.
And we are two Shakespeare nerds who decided to make a podcast about our love for Shakespeare.
In this podcast, we will tackle as many dimensions to Shakespeare's plays as we can by looking at the text, examining the historical context in which it was written, and how the text is viewed through modern lenses of feminism, racism, classism, colonialism, nationalism, ableism, all of the isms.
We will discuss how his plays shaped both the past and present, and, as actors, how his plays can be responsibly performed today.
All while trying our best to approach his works without giving in to bardolatry. So, Shakespeare, anyone? Hi, listeners. Elise here to remind you of all the ways you can support the podcast and the work that Courtney and I do. First up, we have a Patreon. Our Patreon patrons receive exclusive bonus content. Every month we do a roundup of Shakespeare-related content we have found online. We also share Patreon-exclusive bonus episodes of the podcast. These look like extended versions of episodes you've heard here, collaborations with other Shakespeare podcasters, and Courtney and I doing reviews of Shakespeare-adjacent media, like TV shows, movies, and books that are inspired by or loosely based on Shakespeare and Shakespeare plays. Patreon patrons also receive snail mail from the podcast, and some levels even vote on future episodes of our podcast. If you are interested in checking out our Patreon, or just the Shakespeare-related names we've given the tiers of support, head to patreon.com/ShakespeareAnyone. The link is also in our episode description. After you've done that, please rate, review, and follow us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Your review might even make it on an episode. You can also follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and tell a friend. Word of mouth is our best form of advertising. Thank you so much for all of the support you give the podcast. Now, on to the episode.
Hi, Elise.
Hi, Courtney.
How's it going today?
It's going pretty great. How are you?
I'm also doing pretty great. Both of us collectively somehow have a Friday morning off, and it was a wonderful Friday morning to fill with a guest who we cannot wait to share with all of you listeners.
Yes, we are so excited today to be talking to Dr. Darren Freebury-Jones about his forthcoming book, Shakespeare's Borrowed Feathers, and his research into Shakespeare and Shakespeare's contemporaries.
Yeah. And his work really aligns with what we do, grounding Shakespeare as a man who worked in the public theaters in a world of public playhouses, theater companies, entertainment. I mean, like, he put into a book what I've wanted to be put into a singular book.
So listeners, you enjoy this podcast. We're so excited to share with you this book that is doing a lot of the same sort of contextualizing of Shakespeare that we do here on this podcast, but with a broader look at Shakespeare and the other dramatists who are working amongst each other to make theater and an entertainment industry in early modern London.
Mm-hmm.
So a little bit more about our guest today. Dr. Darren Freebury-Jones is the author of the monographs Reading Robert Greene, Recovering Shakespeare's Rival from Routledge, Shakespeare's Tutor, The Influence of Thomas Kyd from Manchester University Press, and Shakespeare's Borrowed Feathers from Manchester University Press. He is the associate editor for the first critical edition of the collected works of Thomas Kyd since 1901, published by Boydell and Brewer. He has also investigated the boundaries of John Marston's dramatic corpus as part of the Oxford Marston project and is the general editor for the collected plays of Robert Greene from Edinburgh University Press. His findings on the work of Shakespeare and his contemporaries have been discussed in national newspapers such as The Times, The Guardian, The Telegraph, The Observer, and The Independent, as well as BBC Radio. His debut poetry collection, Rambling, from Broken Sleep Books, was published in 2024. In 2023, he was elected a Fellow of the Royal Historical Society in recognition for his contributions to historical scholarship. And, as I mentioned earlier, we will be discussing his book, Shakespeare's Borrowed Feathers, How Early Modern Playwrights Shaped the World's Greatest Writer. from Manchester University Press and coming out October 2024. Shakespeare's Borrowed Feathers is a fascinating book exploring the early modern authors who helped to shape Shakespeare's beloved plays. Shakespeare's plays have influenced generations of writers, but who were the early modern playwrights who influenced him? Using the latest techniques in textual analysis, Shakespeare's Borrowed Feathers offers a fresh look at William Shakespeare and reveals the influence of a community of playwrights that shaped his work. This compelling book argues that we need to see early modern drama as a communal enterprise, with playwrights borrowing from and adapting one another's work. From John Lyly's wit to the collaborative genius of John Fletcher to Christopher Marlowe and Ben Jonson, Shakespeare's Borrowed Feathers offers fresh insights into Shakespeare's artistic development and shows us new ways of looking at the masterpieces that have enchanted audiences for centuries. And now, please enjoy our conversation with Dr. Darren Freebury-Jones. Hi, Darren.
Hello. How lovely to finally virtually meet you.
Yes, I've been so excited. We've been mutually following each other for a bit, and it's so exciting to, virtually meet and to get to experience some of your work and share it with our listeners. I'm so excited to talk about your new book today.
It's such a pleasure, and thank you so much for inviting me to be on your brilliant podcast. Thank you.
Thank you for saying that. So validating. So, Darren, what was your first experience with Shakespeare?
Oh, great question. I think my first indirect experience of Shakespeare, I've got a memory at quite a young age of being in the cinema and the final credits for The Lion King were rolling and turning around and seeing just lots of people with tears in their eyes and tears in my eyes as well. And of course, I didn't realise until many, many years later that that was something of an adaptation of Shakespeare's great tragedy of Hamlet. But my first direct experience with Shakespeare, I've got a couple. One is memorising Sonnet 18. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Just as a teenager in high school, I'm not sure why I did it. I wasn't asked to do it. But I felt empowered, I think, by being able to memorise and deliver those beautiful words. And the first Shakespeare play I ever studied as a teenager was Julius Caesar. So I remember being enthralled by that plot of conspiracy. And to mark that as the first Shakespeare play I ever studied, many years later, I had a passage from the play tattooed on my chest. And I think, without that play, my life would be very different. And at the very least, my left breast would look quite different as well.
I feel very similarly about Macbeth. Can I ask what the passage is?
Do you know what? As I was speaking there, I almost forgot. And this does frequently happen. I tend to look at my chest less often than maybe I should. I don't know. There is a tide in the affairs of men, which taken at the flood leads on to fortune, which of course is 2 lines of verse, but the tattooist couldn't fit all of those words in just 2 lines on my chest, unfortunately. So there's 3 lines on my left breast.
Macbeth is that play for me of this is the first play that I remember studying. And it's the play that has, for some reason, continued to be a through line throughout my life with Shakespeare. And I love hearing that somebody else has had that experience with a play of Shakespeare's. This is the first one. This is the thing that kind of hooked you in a way.
And those first encounters are often with the tragedies, aren't they? And I think Macbeth was probably the first play I saw in the theatre. Mm-hmm. I think it might have been in Bristol. And I remember there was a famous TV actor, but I couldn't tell you what his name was. And it was all set in a hotel room. So the Weird Sisters were just cleaners, and all of the action involving advancing the war, the battle scenes, took place on a screen in the hotel room. So you often had news updates, which I think really contributed to the sense of claustrophobia with that play, because for me, Macbeth works best on stage when it is claustrophobic. And a very famous example, of course, would be the 1970s version with Ian McKellen and Judi Dench at the other place in Stratford-upon-Avon, where it all took place in a chalk circle. And as the Macbeths were plotting to murder King Duncan, you had actors planted in the audience, breathing heavily, which I think really contributes to the sense of horror with that play.
Yeah, I agree. And You also mention production of Macbeth and Macbeth working well in a claustrophobic environment in your book.
Yes.
And I was like, yes, I think of it more as having worked with it a few times now, I think of it more as if we were in modern genres, it'd be like a psychological thriller more than a tragedy. It'd be something that you just feel so tense and anxious watching. Yes. So I love that you included that in your book as well as you're talking about these other playwrights that Shakespeare was writing with. And just to get into your book, your new book, Shakespeare's Borrowed Feathers, is a study of Shakespeare's canon and how he was inspired by or collaborated with other early modern playwrights. What inspired you to explore this topic?
Well, I've done a lot of acting and a little bit of directing. So I think going back to Macbeth being quite formative, I think it was the first Shakespeare play I ever acted in. And I played the murderer who has the best line in the play. What, you egg, young fry of treachery? And I also played Satan. And during the tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow speech, I had to dress Macbeth. Now, I can hardly dress myself. So I remember there were titters from the audience as I got Macbeth's buttons done up all of the wrong way, which in hindsight I think is quite genius because there's lots of references, I like to think so anyway, to Macbeth not necessarily being well suited to kingship. And there's lots of references to clothing. Why do you dress us in borrowed robes, like a dwarfish thief in giant's clothing, for example? I'm paraphrasing there. So I like to think actually it was, a good approach, dressing Macbeth in such a disastrous way. But of course, theatre, acting, it's an inherently collaborative enterprise. So I've always been interested in how early modern playwrights work together, also with actors and theatre managers and so on. And I think there was a real threshold moment for me when I was in my third year as an undergraduate at university in Wales. And we were looking at the book of Sir Thomas More, which is considered a collaborative play. There's around 5 authors involved in that, and we think Shakespeare might have been one of them. And I was just very interested in looking at the ways in which one author took over another author's stint, and just how those voices communed. And then I ended up doing an MA dissertation on the Shakespeare Apocrypha, so plays that had been attributed to Shakespeare. And that was just a great opportunity to read as widely and attentively as possible. And then I ended up doing a PhD on Thomas Kyd's influence on Shakespeare. And I then wrote a book several years later based on the thesis about Thomas Kyd. I then wrote a book on Robert Greene, who I think is a really fascinating figure with quite the critical reputation, quite a negative reputation, because infamously he called Shakespeare an upstart crow. And then I thought, why not write a book about everybody? So I was really interested in charting how Shakespeare interacted with, was influenced by, and sometimes collaborated with other playwrights, all the way back to the 1580s with the comedies of John Lyly, and then right at the end of Shakespeare's career, around 1613, when he's collaborating with his younger contemporary, John Fletcher.
Can you tell us a little bit more about your research process for this book and what went into researching all of these other playwrights and how you found where there's moments of collaboration or inspiration?
Yes, I'm reminded of James Shapiro with 1599, and he says that he wrote that book because there were gaps in his knowledge. So I had done quite a lot of work on Shakespeare's relationship with Elizabethan playwrights, of course, through my university studies and through the books I'd already written. And for me, this was a great opportunity to expand my knowledge of other writers, your Ben Jonsons, your Thomas Dekkers, and so on. So for me, it was just a case of reading as much scholarship on links between those playwrights and Shakespeare as possible, but also reading their works as well, which was a bit tricky because I set myself a self-imposed deadline, but then I was lingering over Johnson and thinking, oh, he's an interesting character and I just want to read every word he ever wrote. But I can't. I've got to move on to chapter 8 or 9. And my approach to looking at links between Shakespeare and other dramatists was, yes, we're looking at similarities in terms of plot or shared source material, themes, particular topics, but also looking at it through the lens of advances in digital technology that we have today, which I think casts a whole new light on these over 400-year-old dramatic texts.
So one of those digital resources you use, and these come up in the news every so often, we hear about, researchers have found links between Shakespeare and this by using this like text analysis, the same sort of text analysis that college and university students have to import their papers in, and then it scans them for plagiarism, right?
Yeah.
You specifically talk about a database that is called collocations and engrams. Can you describe for our listeners what that database is and how you used it in your research?
Yeah, so collocations and engrams is essentially a database containing 527 plays from 1552 all the way to 1657. And it's designed by a software engineer and also a brilliant Shakespeare scholar named Pervez Rizvi. So there's loads of things you can do with this database. And one of them is you can see how a play, so a target play like Hamlet, for example, how it compares in terms of shared phrases with all other plays in the database. So the database ranks each play pairing. So, Hamlet and then say another Shakespeare play, and then second place might be Hamlet and, the tragedy of Hoffman, for example. What's really interesting about those rankings is we learn that authorship trumps all other factors. So authors repeated themselves more than they repeated other authors. But there are nuances to the results as well. So I found that in a lot of cases, it validated scholarship, arguing that one play was influenced by another. Also, genre has an influence as well as shared source material. But what's really great about the database is it's not numbers alone. So for humanist scholars, for example, who might be ill at these numbers, you can actually look at the phrases according to their dramatic context, and you can see if there are similarities in terms of that context or characterization and so forth. So it's just been an incredible resource to use, I think.
I remember reading, like you said, it allows you to look at phrases in context. You can use the same, I think it's like 3 words at minimum that it looks at. Is that correct?
I think 2.
Or 2?
Yeah,
okay.
I won't go too much into the technical detail, which could be a bit boring. What is meant by an engram is a phrase consisting of at least 2 words, so 2 continuous words onwards. Just to give an example of a phrase shared between Julius Caesar and Hamlet, from the purpose of. Now, collocations are a little bit different, where you've got matching words between plays, but with other words in between them. So think of Shakespeare's association of hounds, greyhounds, mongrel, and spaniel. They're separated by the words grim and or in King Lear, and just the word and in Macbeth, when Macbeth's having his conversation with the assassins he's commissioned to bump off Banquo.
Fantastic. Phrases where the same 2 words or maybe have some words inserted, but it's in the same sort of larger phrase.
Yeah, within 10 words. I think it's like 10 words maximum intervening. Yeah.
So it lets you see these things and how the playwright is actively using them, instead of just this word is used this many times, or Shakespeare uses this word more than this word that this other playwright uses, something like that can seem to tell a story, but maybe isn't telling the data story that is so accurate.
Yes.
And I know it can feel very dry, but I think at a high level, looking at data and telling a data story is just the same as telling any other sort of story. So as you navigate through comparing Shakespeare's writing with his collaborators, you also discuss some other methods of database text analysis in comparison to collocations and engrams. And can you explain how some of these methods lead to maybe some misleading connections or incorrect attributions for Shakespeare and his fellow playwrights?
Yes.
How can lead us astray?
Yes, and it's a hotly contested discipline, attribution studies, trying to work out who wrote what. And I don't think there's a single glass slipper approach. This isn't Cinderella. We should apply as many different approaches as possible, including, most importantly, actually reading these plays and maybe putting them up on their feet, a bit of practical criticism, performing them, for example. So I'm very wary, for example, you touched upon it there, Elise, of methods that are based on the frequencies of single words. So a lot of scholars will divide so-called content words, so words with meaning like happy, for example. They'll divide them from function words, so words that essentially serve grammatical purposes, such as and or of. And, according to the frequencies of these bags of words, they'll attribute, for example, parts of the Henry VI plays to Christopher Marlowe. So you touched upon collaboration there. This is very difficult because there are lots of practitioners applying this kind of analysis, and they're all coming up with entirely different results. And even practitioners who have had their work published by major scholarly publishers, for example, you'll then get different research teams will rerun their method and get entirely different results. And those practitioners will say, oh, well, you didn't apply our methods properly. And maybe we could say that, or maybe we could say that method can't be reproduced then. So it's actually scientifically worthless. And I think as well, this idea that function words operate below the level of an author consciousness, I'm not sure about that at all, because these practitioners will claim that single words are of more use than phrases, because phrases can be imitated. And of course, that's something I explore throughout the book, is Shakespeare imitating the dramatic language of other writers. But for a phrase to make sense, think to be or not to be, for example, of course it's going to contain function words. So actually, authors are imitating each other's function words. So I'm really, really not sure about those methods. And I think the great thing about collocations and engrams is it's very large scale. These phrases are highlighted by automated methods. And I also explore some other approaches towards dramatic phrasing, where you'll have practitioners punch in a phrase into a database and then draw up all results. And this is incredibly laborious, and we don't need it with advances in technology anymore. So you can only apply that kind of method, such as the so-called literature online or micro-attribution methods, to small samples of text. Mm-hmm. So if you've got a speech of just 176 words, for example, and then you just give it to what author shares the most hits, the most phrases, shared word combinations with it. Well, what if you do that to an entire play? I suspect that if you did that to Hamlet, you'd end up generating about 20 different authors for that play by Shakespeare. So I think you see the perils there of small sample sizes, and that's a real bugbear in the field when it comes to applying these digital methods.
Mm-hmm. And the computer does not understand the meaning behind the words in the same way that a human brain does, or that as you said, you touched upon this earlier, of actually reading the plays, actually reading them in close proximity to each other. Because in theory, an audience member could have seen them at the same time and heard them at the same time. And experiencing that practical application of these scripts as they are is different and can provide more, because again, the computer is looking for bits of code that match other bits of code, and it doesn't necessarily provide meaning. It's the humans who try to apply meaning to this. And yeah, so the computer will spit out, like you said, if you look at all of Hamlet, it'll say, well, Thomas Kyd uses the word to a lot. It just doesn't, I pulled that out of nowhere.
Yeah.
But it'll say that, and it'll say, maybe Thomas Kyd wrote this, because to it, it's going, I'm counting this many twos and this many twos. And it's not saying, well, this is in a larger context. And you touched upon this too, of like, what question are we trying to answer doing this attribution research and scholarship? Is it, did Shakespeare write this? Or is it, I think the question that, to me, I hear you asking in your book is, can we tell like how these plays interact with each other, or how these authors are in a dialogue with each other, which feels, as a theater practitioner, more rooted in theater practice,
yes,
which is how these were created and came into being.
Yeah, I think that's so important, that these advances in digital technology, they're wonderful. And I think they can cast new lights on these old plays, but they're a tool that we can use. But I don't think that digital technology can ever replace humans or the humanities. And looking at these plays written by writers who came through a humanist education, I think that's really important to remember. And I'm not a fan of digital scholars throwing words like subjective when it comes to your more traditional literary critical approaches, because I think they're absolutely fundamental still.
Right. And as I've been saying, like the digital scholarship, there is still subjectivity to it, because when you tell a data story, you're still telling a story.
Yeah.
You know, your book goes into over attribution or under attribution. And in reflecting on reading your work, I thought to myself, I was like, it feels like the other end of the scholarly spectrum of the authorship question. You know, you get too far into how much of early modern drama did Shakespeare write. Do you end up on the other side going, well, there's no way one man could have written all that this man from Stratford-upon-Avon could have been this singular genius who wrote all of this? And do you end up just on the other end of that scholarship spectrum? Anyway, that was a rabbit hole that I mentally went down. You know, to conceive of him as this genius that appeared on the London at the London Theatre and was correcting other plays, or was, you know, coming into fix and didn't have a journey of his own and growth of his own as a playwright. It's not a true conception of a human being. And I was just like, that's maybe how we can get from diving too deep into, is he considering him a genius, to then ending up into maybe he didn't exist at all. Yeah.
And I think despite being a heated field, attribution studies, it's very valuable. It's you know, a legitimate field of scholarship that can be traced back to the 19th century. And it's worth emphasizing that, yes, authors collaborated directly during the period, but for the most part, Shakespeare writes his plays solo. So he tends to co-author plays at the beginning and towards the end of his career. And I think one thing I've tried to do with the book is just place Shakespeare in his original historical and theatrical context. And you can see the ways in which his grammar school education, for example, they work students very hard during the period. It was pretty much the equivalent of a modern classics degree. And it would have equipped Shakespeare with the tools to enter the trade of playwriting and also writing poetry. And how you could see in comparing him to other playwrights that Shakespeare is not necessarily unusual in terms of his biographical background, what we know of it and what we don't know. So I think it's a very important picture to provide Shakespeare amongst his contemporary dramatists. And in that way, we stop detaching Shakespeare from the actual community in which he was a fundamental part of.
Yeah, you touched on this briefly, but you look at the stylistic differences between the university-educated playwrights of the time who, you know, have been to Oxford, and how they have a very specific Oxfordian style almost to their rhetoric and how they write, and they're a little bit more rigid in their style, and it's very and it can be very established. Whereas there are other early modern playwrights who have similar backgrounds to Shakespeare, a grammar school background, and they actually write similarly to Shakespeare because they've not gone and gotten that degree, and they're much more related to how they would have engaged with classic texts in their classic grammar school education.
Yeah, and that's worth stressing, that Shakespeare is not the only Shake scene in the country when he appears on the scene. But yes, that's something I explore, is how Shakespeare's style differs from, you know, your Cambridge-educated Christopher Marlowe or Oxford-educated George Peele. And one thing that the university-educated dramatists tend to do is stick to the 10-syllable lines. So 5 unstressed syllables, 5 stressed. That rhythm that we sometimes say resembles a human heartbeat, dee-dum, dee-dum, dee-dum. Others might say that's de-dumbing it down. But Shakespeare, right from the off, he's mixing things up. He's adding an 11th syllable, the so-called feminine ending, which comes across as quite a sexist term today, I think. But it gives me a sense of Shakespeare having an actorly ear, having performed, in the plays of other dramatists, and having seen plays in performance. And of course, to succeed as an Elizabethan player, you needed an incredible memory. And I think in terms of rhetoric as well, the likes of Christopher Marlowe, they tend to use figures of repetition to essentially repeat the same points. Whereas Shakespeare always has characterization and dramatic context at the forefront of his mind. So Shakespeare's background as an actor, very important, but he wasn't the only actor turned dramatist. You've got other playwrights such as Robert Wilson, Ben Jonson also started off as an actor, and lots of playwrights who don't have a university background, including Ben Jonson, who was very particular about showing off his learning. But also Thomas Kyd, who, as I explore in the book, seems to me to resemble early Shakespeare stylistically more than the likes of Christopher Marlowe, which might surprise some listeners.
Speaking of surprises, was there any discoveries you made during this research that surprised or delighted you while you were working on this book?
Yeah, I think it was just a wonderful journey exploring Shakespeare's career and how his style changes during the course of it. And what I found was that his early plays often read like patchworks of phrases you will find in the dramas of Christopher Marlowe, Thomas Kyd, and so on. And yet, as his career progresses, he becomes much less imitative in terms of other plays that are on at the same time. So he almost seems to turn away from the dramatic styles of writers like Ben Jonson, Thomas Dekker, John Marston. But even late in his career, he also seems to gaze wistfully at the past, and he's often returning to the Elizabethan plays that were in the repertory when he first started off. And I love that idea of Shakespeare as a dramatist who's often gazing into the past for inspiration. What can he take from times of yore and make fresh for his contemporary audiences? Because that's what we do with Shakespeare now, of course. We put on these 400-year-old plays and we say, look at the ways in which we can shine a light on what's going on in the media, in the news today. So that was quite delightful. I was also very interested in Shakespeare's relationship with John Lyly, who was a playwright I didn't know an awful lot about before I came to write the book. But with John Lyly, you've got a dramatist who anticipates Shakespeare's comedies in a great many ways. So his plays contain battles of wit, song incorporated into the drama. They often have parallel plot lines between upper class figures and lower class figures. And I was pleasantly surprised to find that Shakespeare seems to have turned back to John Lyly much later in his career. So again, you're getting a sense of Shakespeare as a dramatist, looking to see what worked with audiences in the past and how he can bring that to modern audiences. And another aspect of the book, which I've touched upon that surprised me, was that Shakespeare seems to have been influenced by Thomas Kyd. He's probably most famous for the Spanish tragedy, the first revenge tragedy, just as influenced by Kyd as he was by Christopher Marlowe, whereas the narrative tends to be how Marlowe was his rival, his competitor, and haunted Shakespeare throughout his career, which to an extent I agree with. But I think it's worth resurrecting the ghost of Thomas Kyd as well when it comes to that kind of discourse.
I love that you can kind of chart this trajectory of Shakespeare's development as a dramatist, finding their own voice, and therefore is more imitative of others who are successful at the time because he's also immersed in this world of theater and seeing these other plays. And is it the Spanish tragedy that you refer to as the Avengers of the time?
It was a blockbuster hit, yes. I refer to it as Avengers Endgame of the Elizabethan period, yes.
Yeah, because of course, if somebody's that successful, you're going to, as you're finding your own voice as an artist, working through incorporating things that worked well for others. And then there's a period where it's, as he gets older, starts looking back and starts adapting and looking at plays, again, like as a theater artist, as somebody who works with other playwrights and their trajectories. I'm like, yeah, that's a playwright. That is a playwright's career right there.
Yeah.
The book as a whole really grounds Shakespeare as a man working in the theater. And, we often say he was just a guy working in the theater who happened to be very good at it.
Yes.
and who luckily also happened to have a couple friends who, after he passed away, grabbed all of the materials they could and published them for us. But there's a whole, you call it a magpie nest,
Yes,
of playwrights who are they're all borrowing from each other. They're all seeing each other's work and going, that's good. I'm going to take that, going to use that later. I think it's Shakespeare in Love where they're like giving each other feedback,
yes.
There's a potential for that happening here, that there's this collaboration and community that's not also necessarily competition, because the theater is a collaborative art form, as you said earlier, or, this person's working with this person and, this worked really well over at the curtain, but when we're at the rose, we're going to do it this way. While he's writing solitary, it's not just sitting in a room by himself with a play fully formed. There's some sort of active work that's happening in the theater with it.
Absolutely. I love everything you're saying there. And I love what you were saying about Shakespeare developing his own distinct voice. And I think at the start of his career, as an actor playwright, he's so embedded in the theatrical vernacular of the period that it's only natural that he would be recycling phrases from plays by other dramatists. And I think a lot of it was probably subconsciously. And so even through competition between rival playing companies, that becomes a form of collaboration, because they're all servicing a commercial operation, that they're trying to entertain and engage audiences. And I think that's something that gets forgotten by a lot of people when it comes to Shakespeare and his milieu, is that we see these as great works of art, great works of literature, but that's not how they were seen during Shakespeare's lifetime. Plays weren't seen as works of art in quite the same way as poetry, like Shakespeare's sonnets were. And when Ben Jonson referred to his plays as works in 1616, he got a lot of stick for it. He was saying how arrogant to call these plays works. So I think that's really important to keep in mind, is that emphasis on borrowing from each other, that's how drama thrives, and that's how they were able to make money, these playing companies of the early modern era.
And I wonder how much of a disservice is done to the popular understanding of Shakespeare, because theaters primarily put on Shakespeare plays. It's a novelty to see a Kyd play or a Marlowe play.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking about how we as consumers of Shakespeare plays don't get the same experience that scholars get, because it's not placed in front of us. And for scholars, you have to go digging. So that's something else I'm thinking about when we talk about Shakespeare and the rest of early modern society. How much of it is influenced by the fact that there seems to be this gate kept around Shakespeare and the popular consciousness of his works and his creations of his works.
Yeah, and I think that's very tricky, and theatre companies should do what they can to showcase the work of Shakespeare's contemporaries. And you do find with a lot of scholars that they almost start to resent Shakespeare because there's so much emphasis placed on him. And they say, ignore Shakespeare, check out your John Fletchers or your Christopher Marlowes. And for me, that's wrong-headed, because I imagine that practically all of those scholars, their first encounters with early modern drama was through studying Shakespeare. So I think Shakespeare is a crucial conduit for the appreciation of these other writers. And I think we actually enhance our appreciation of Shakespeare by looking at the works of other dramatists that inspired him, influenced him, because we can see how Shakespeare often takes a different tack. But we can also see how Shakespeare sometimes turns away from what was popular during the period. For instance, city comedy, hugely popular genre. You've got your John Marston, your Thomas Dekkers, Ben Jonson, reflecting London society as audiences might have known it. And Shakespeare doesn't write what we could outright call a city comedy. He kind of flirts with the genre in Measure for Measure, depicting Vienna as a city-state. The Merry Wives of Windsor probably, to me, feels like the closest thing Shakespeare writes to a city comedy. But it's not London, it's a provincial community, Windsor, that resembles the world Shakespeare would have known in Stratford-upon-Avon. And also how Shakespeare incorporates elements of masque. So again, to go back to Ben Jonson, think of The Masque of Blackness, for example, which he wrote in 1605. And that courtly masque would have cost around £300,000 in today's money, where you've got these gods descending from the rafters, this huge emphasis on gorgeous costumes, visual splendor. And I imagine that would make a playwright quite a bit of money.
Mm-hmm.
Shakespeare incorporates elements of the masque form into plays like The Winter's Tale, The Tempest, but so far as we know, he never actually writes a masque, a courtly masque himself. So I think placing him in the context of what other dramatists were doing, we can see what differentiates Shakespeare as well as what he was influenced by.
Yeah. And I think that goes to, I think it was something Elise said, which was like, Shakespeare's audiences could see these differences and these similarities by attending these plays happening at the same time. But for a modern audience, we don't have that.
Yeah.
But just as something that popped up is like how your book centers this and like allows readers to imagine this in a way that we don't get in our theater experience as a modern audience.
Do you think that comes down to money? You're going to sell less tickets if you put on a Thomas Kyd or a John Lyly, for example.
Yeah.
Which I think there's just been such a shift in terms of our perception of plays of the period that now it's Shakespeare's the money earner, and any other playwright becomes a financial risk for a theatre, which is a great pity, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's probably seen as a financial risk. I think that every theater teaches their audience what to expect, and that you can work with your audience and understand where your audience is at and know how to market a Kyd play or a Marlowe play. You could get some people to come and see it. But also, there are plays of Shakespeare's that don't get produced as often because they're not as well known. And I think that the kind of cultural experience of Shakespeare as well is very limited to a select number of plays. And again, I think it's the artistic director and the theater company deciding to work with their audience to cultivate the audience that's going to appreciate that instead of producing from a place of fear.
And Pericles is on at the moment in Stratford-upon-Avon, and audiences have been so pleasantly surprised that it's been called an unexpected hit, and it's such a fabulous production. And you can see why Pericles was, which sounds weird to us today, far and away one of Shakespeare's most popular plays during his own era. So we need more Pericles, as well as the plays of other dramatists, I think. More unexpected hits.
Yes. Programming more early modern and programming more classics that aren't just Shakespeare.
Shakespeare's top 10.
Yeah, that's how you can get your audience to be introduced to these other playwrights and these other plays. I think it's also theater practitioners being educated about that these plays exist, because I think to my undergraduate program, and, I took multiple Shakespeare classes, but early modern drama was maybe offered in the English department, but as a theater practitioner, I wasn't diving deep into other early modern dramas. So if the people producing and creating theater are also, Courtney, I liked your, this gate around Shakespeare. If they're only shown Shakespeare and only taught to engage with Shakespeare in a certain way, then they're also not going to feel scaffolded well enough to engage with Kyd, Marlowe, Johnson, Lyly, etc. I know that's something that we on the podcast try to work towards, bringing this, the world of scholarship and the world of theater closer and closer together, and bridging that gap to very different worlds, both caring about the same thing.
And I think that's incredibly important, is bridging that gap, because for me, there's not just one approach when it comes to Shakespeare and contemporary playwrights, and it's the infinite variety of educating people and getting them to engage with these topics. That's what it's all about. And I think I come from quite a fortuitous background in terms of having engaged with theatre in the capacity of an actor, or having done some directing, but also having that scholarly background as well.
You're like the Shakespeare of scholarship, then.
We'll have to put that in my bio. That would be lovely. Yeah. Not pretentious at all. Yeah.
We're kind of dancing around this question, and I want to just kind of have some final thoughts on it. We're talking about these other playwrights and this greater appreciation and greater knowledge of early modern drama as a whole. And what can audiences and readers of Shakespeare gain? What benefit does it bring to audiences, readers, students who are studying Shakespeare to have this broader context?
Yeah, great question. I gave a talk on the subject of Shakespeare's Borrowed Feathers just the other day, and a professor stood up at the end of the talk and said, "Anyone who ignores your work ignores history," which I thought might be a great tagline for the book. But, in terms of the benefits, it broadens our understanding of Shakespeare. It places Shakespeare in his original historical and theatrical context. I think it expands our appreciation of him as a playwright, because you can learn a bit more about the genetic makeup of his plays. What is inspiring him, what avenues he's choosing not to go down. And for me, it's win-win, because then you can also discover all of these other remarkable members of this broad and brilliant network of dramatists. And you can expand your appreciation of the likes of Thomas Kyd, John Lyly, Thomas Dekker, and so on. So it was an absolute joy to write the book. And I think if people enjoy reading it half as much, then that would be fabulous.
Well, thank you again so much, Darren, for joining us today on the podcast to talk about Shakespeare's Borrowed Feathers. I thoroughly enjoyed reading it, and I think it does exactly what you hope that it can do, which is ground Shakespeare as a person living and working in a time with other real people, and it lifts these names that we hear alongside Shakespeare's, and it can give a better sense of who they were as playwrights as well, instead of just secondary characters in Shakespeare's story, which is lovely. So again, thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure and privilege, and I'm delighted that you enjoyed the book.
Thank you for listening.
I'm Courtney Smith.
And I'm Elise Sharp.
This is Shakespeare, Anyone?
Thank you so much for listening to Shakespeare, Anyone. Works referenced in this episode are available in the episode description. Our theme music is Never Ending Minute by Sounds Like Sander. If you would like to support us, it would help us out if you would hit the subscribe button, like us, leave a comment, write a review, share us on social media, tell a friend about us, all the things. We'd appreciate it.
You can also support the podcast at patreon.com/ShakespeareAnyone.
Patreon patrons get access to exclusive bonus content throughout the year. The link is also in the episode description.
For more, you can visit our website, ShakespeareAnyone.com, follow us on Instagram at ShakespeareAnyonePod, or Twitter at ShakespeareAnyone. For Twitter, that's Shakespeare, Any, and the number 1. Every other platform is spelled out like the name of the podcast.
Now, because you listened all the way to the end of the credits, here's a completely random Shakespeare quote for you.
From Measure for Measure, Act 1, Scene 5, said by Lucio, "Our doubts are traitors, and make us lose the good we oft might win by fearing to attempt."